Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Every single day, completely behind the scenes of global finance, there is this massive, high-stakes balancing act going on. We absolutely have to stop financial crime, but at the exact same time, we have to enable vital, life-saving humanitarian relief. Just think about it for a second. What happens when millions of dollars urgently need to cross borders into a conflict zone? How do international banking systems keep illicit money out without accidentally cutting off the very lifeline that allows organizations to do good? It is an incredibly complex framework fraught with literal life and death consequences, and today we're going to break it all down. Here is our roadmap for unpacking how international systems protect global finance without suffocating civil society. We'll be covering understanding NGOs and NPOs, the financial crime vulnerability, the problem of de-risking, FATF's balanced risk approach, and finally, proportionate due diligence. Let's kick things off with Section 1, Understanding NGOs and NPOs. It's honestly fascinating how looking through a regulatory lens completely flips our understanding of everyday concepts. For example, when the United Nations talks about a non-governmental organization, an NGO, they're describing a nonprofit, voluntary citizens group that operates entirely independently from the government. That's the humanitarian view. But global regulators, specifically the Financial Action Task Force, or FAF, they use a totally different term, NPO, or nonprofit organization, and they evaluate these groups purely by their financial footprint. So, to a regulator, an NPO is an entity that raises or disperses funds for charitable, religious, or social purposes. It's the exact same group of people delivering aid on the ground, but the regulators are laser-focused on how and where the money moves. Now, this dual identity creates a massive core tension. In one breath, these organizations are serving absolutely essential public purposes. We're talking delivering humanitarian relief, driving long-term development, and running vital advocacy campaigns in some of the hardest-to-reach places on Earth. But in the very next breath, the exact same channels they use to deliver that critical aid are highly vulnerable to abuse. The risks are severe, things like terrorist financing, fraud, illicit fund diversion, and sanctions evasion. The hard truth is, the nobility of an organization's work doesn't somehow magically cancel out the vulnerability of their operating environment. A weak control environment in a war zone is a prime target for bad actors, completely regardless of the charity's good intentions. Moving right along to Section 2, the financial crime vulnerability. Put yourself in the shoes of a bank's compliance officer for a second, and really consider how these organizations actually have to function in the real world. NGOs rely heavily on cross-border donations coming from all over the globe. They operate heavily in cash because, well, digital banking simply doesn't exist in a disaster zone or a collapsed state. They have to rely on really complex networks of local intermediaries just to get supplies past checkpoints. And they face intensely urgent disbursement needs. When an earthquake hits, money has to move today, not after a 30-day corporate review period. If you look at this through the strict lens of traditional banking, you can instantly see why these completely legitimate everyday realities trigger massive anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing alarms. But here is the absolute crux of the matter, and it's a point that gets misunderstood constantly in the financial sector. NGOs are not inherently high risk. The label of nonprofit or NGO isn't the risk, the operation is. Risk is tied strictly to their specific activities, their chosen geographies, the complexity of their funding flows, and the strength of their internal governance. An NGO with highly transparent funding and a safe, verifiable delivery model is entirely different from one operating with zero oversight in an active war zone. So treating them all as universally high risk just because they're charities completely ignores the reality of how risk actually works.
And that brings us to Section 3, the problem of de-risking.
This leads us to a massive systemic problem known in the industry as automatic de-risking. This is a deeply flawed practice where financial institutions just reject a relationship entirely simply because the entity has an NGO label. A bank might look at a charity operating in a tough region and decide that doing the complex due diligence is just too expensive or way too complicated, so they just close the accounts or block the international transfers outright. It's basically a defensive maneuver. But this kind of blanket rejection is a dangerous trap because overly strict, inflexible banking rules can literally cut off life-saving aids to the populations who need it most, ultimately paralyzing legitimate global relief efforts. So instead of rejecting NGOs just for existing or operating in tough environments, banks really need to hunt for actual specific risk indicators. What does real risk look like? Well, it looks like opaque ownership or confusing governance structures. It looks like unexplained cross-border flows that completely dwarf the charity's stated size and capacity. Or maybe it's financial activity that is wildly inconsistent with their stated mission, like an education charity suddenly buying heavy machinery. It could also be weak oversight of local implementing partners on the ground, combined with really poor record-keeping. Those are the true red flags that justify enhanced monitoring or an account closure, not just shutting down basic operations because the word charity is in the name. Which leads us to the solution in Section 4, FATF's Balanced Risk Approach. To fix this incredibly dangerous trend of automatic de-risking, global regulators really had to step in. Listen to this specific directive from the Financial Action Task Force's 2023 revision to Recommendation 8. They state, measures affecting NPOs should be targeted and proportionate, and not used to suppress lawful civil society activity through blanket assumptions. This policy shift in 2023 gives the regulatory approach some serious gravitas. We have the global watchdog for money laundering explicitly demanding that financial institutions stop making lazy blanket assumptions. Treating all civil society organizations as radioactive is officially no longer an acceptable compliance strategy. The mandate here is crystal clear. Protect the sector from abuse without undermining legitimate access to financial services. The whole goal of this framework is to harmonize two vital global goods instead of pitting them against each other in some zero-sum game. Yes, we absolutely must have a secure global financial system that shuts out terrorists and fraudsters, but we also absolutely must have a functioning civil society that can feed, clothe, and advocate for vulnerable populations. The framework basically demands that security and humanitarian access coexist.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, proportionate due diligence.
So, what does this balanced approach actually look like when it's put into practice? Well, a mature financial institution won't just guess, they investigate. First, they dive deep into the organization's exact mission and legal status to ensure everything is totally above board. Next, they'll review the governance structure and the origin of the funds, like who is actually backing this charity. Then, they analyze the exact geographic footprint and tightly scrutinize the local partner networks. And finally, they assess the internal controls over how the money actually hits the ground and reaches the final beneficiaries. It's really about doing the hard homework to truly understand the organization's real-world operating model rather than just taking the easy way out. Ultimately, we've got to avoid two highly dangerous extremes. On one side, you have suspicion by default. That leads directly to harmful de-risking, cutting off vulnerable people from critical aid. On the exact opposite side, you have naive acceptance, and that opens the door wide to terrorist financing and massive fraud operating under the guise of charity. Neither of those is an acceptable path. The only correct, sustainable path forward requires proportionate, well-informed due diligence. That means applying thoughtful, risk-based safeguards that are tailored specifically to the realities of each individual organization. I want to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. Are we truly balancing risk with global good? Every compliance officer, international regulator, and nonprofit director has to answer this question daily. Are we building systems that balance the absolute necessity of financial security with the undeniable urgency of human survival? Getting this balance right isn't just a regulatory checkbox. It's literally the difference between life-saving resources reaching the most vulnerable or being hopelessly blocked at a border. Keep that in mind the next time you see a headline about global aid or financial crackdowns. Thanks for joining me today.